Okay, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be with you this evening, um, but I thought that we'd go ahead and do the lecture. It's easy enough to record it. It's mostly looking at Photoshop, actually, which is something, of course, we haven't dealt with in this class at all. We're going to be working digitally here for this assignment. Just one little taste of working digitally. And so it's a short little lecture, maybe 20 minutes or so here. But before we get to that, I want to talk about just some business things. Here, looking at the syllabus, we because I'm not able to be with you, we will push both the portrait project critique and the lighting and portraiture test. Fairly short test, but we're going to push that until next week. So then this quiz, there's going to be a quiz over digital basics, which is stuff that I'm talking about tonight. And then some information from 8 through 10 will also be on that, but that will be shoved down to April 3rd. So basically, take these, shove them down a week, and then we will do both. We will do the portrait project critique next week on the 27th, and you'll notice that the digital printing critique wasn't due until April 3rd anyways. We had a couple of weeks for that. Okay, the presentations, the historical presentations, I don't think we had a full sign up for all these anyways, so it's okay. We'll double up. We'll do these March 20 presentations on the 27th. Okay? So, now that we get the business out of the way, certainly let me know if you have questions about that, if I can clarify what's going on. But we're going to move right over into Photoshop, actually. I unfortunately can't show you the actual process of scanning a negative because I don't have the scanner here. They're in the lab on the counter next to the Macs in the photo lab. But this is a scanned black and white negative. Now, there are really, really detailed instructions taped to the cabinets above the Macs in the photo lab. If you follow those in detail, you'll be good. The scanning portion of it is not that difficult as long as you make sure that you use the exact settings that are on the sheets of paper up there. Okay, so what that does is it saves a TIFF file. A TIFF file, TIFF, is ideal here because it doesn't compress the information. A JPEG actually compresses it, which essentially means it's sort of taking some digital shortcuts. It's making it a smaller file size, and in order to do that, it has to sort of take some shortcuts when it's forming the pixels. Because what we've taken is a sheet of film, of course, that's very analog, and turned it into something digital, which is based on little tiny squares. If you zoom in really, really close here, eventually you get to these little squares that are the pixels. And so we always want to use a TIFF file when scanning, generally, because then we don't lose any of our image data. So this is a TIFF scanned from a negative, and I want you guys to follow a few steps. There's a whole lot of things that you can do to negatives, just like you can do in the darkroom. There's a whole lot of detailed work you can do, dodging and burning specific areas, using complex masks if you're used to masking things in Photoshop and tweaking individual parts of an image. You can definitely do all that, but there's really just kind of three areas that I want you guys to work on, that I want you guys to complete for this assignment. The first one is just cleaning up the dust spots. Most of you guys have seen as you're printing in the darkroom, you got dust on the negative, it shows up in the print. Well, if you got dust on it, it's going to also show up in the scan. So the first thing that we can do is just clean that up. So you see all of these kind of areas over here, these little flecks right here, those represent dust spots, right? In the hair, all through here, whatever that is, something actually maybe on the negative there. There's a little, looks like a little hair right here maybe. Okay, so cleaning this up is relatively easy in terms of like technical skill, but it takes a little while. It can get a little tedious, but just get down, get to a nice little system. Don't do it randomly, but get yourself a nice little flow and a nice little system, and it can go fairly well. So the tool that you need to use to do this is the spot healing tool. It's over here on the left, and the spot healing brush tool. It's J for short. J is the keyboard shortcut. And so you see the circle that appeared here, that's of course my brush size. You should not be working this big. You should choose a brush size that is just a little bit bigger than the dust spots you're planning on removing. So I will use the bracket key, left bracket, to decrease the size of this. That's the easiest way to do it. Otherwise, you can come up into the brush options menu up here at the top and change the size with the slider. You can go ahead and leave the hardness at 100. For this, it shouldn't really matter. That's just how soft or hard the edge of your circle, the edge of your brush is. But let's kind of get to work here. So I'm going to come zoom in real close here and maybe even get a smaller brush. And actually, you know what? Before I do that, go ahead and open up my layers panel here. That's my other screen here. Oh, right, yeah. So this is all from last year, last year's demo. So I'm actually going to get rid of a lot of these and kind of start from scratch here. So just ignore these other layers here real quick. But what I'm going to do is just add a new blank layer. You can do that just by doing new layer like this, or you can also do Command Option Shift N. Either way, okay. That creates a blank layer. What we try not to do is edit our original layer, our background layer here. In other words, the original kind of scan. We don't want to edit that. We want to leave that layer alone. It's called non-destructive editing. You don't actually destroy any pixels on the original image. So we'll go to layer 2 and actually do our cloning or our healing brush there. Okay. So we want to make sure though that the healing brush is set to sample all layers up at the top or it won't work. Okay. If you don't have it set to sample all layers, it'll just look at this blank layer and therefore it won't select anything. It won't be cloning anything. But as long as you have that selected, you can come in here and start to click away at these dust spots. And what Photoshop does is it looks at pixels and texture near the dust spot, near what you're trying to remove, and kind of replicates that. Okay. So as I say, this is not really technically that difficult, but you know, it's going to take a little while. Okay. All right. So certainly, you know, for the sake of this lecture, I am not going to click through all of these, but what I will kind of show you is the system I usually do is just using the spacebar. You can bring up the hand tool, and if I finish this corner, for example, I got all the dust out of there, I can use the hand tool to just scrub over or scroll over here, and then continue on down my photo. Okay, if I finish up with this area, then I can continue on through here. With big hairs like that, you can sometimes get it all, and that's okay. That's not too bad. Photoshop did okay. But with any little scratches like this or hairs, if it doesn't work like that, obviously you can just hit Command-Z to undo. Then you can do little bits at a time. It's always generally best with the healing tools, with the clone stamp tool, to work in small chunks at a time, as small of a section as you can usually. Okay. So say I've got to the end here, I can just then spacebar to bring up the hand tool, kind of pan down, hand tool down a little bit, and just continue working through it. Okay? You'll run into tricks. This one had a hard edge, so I'm going to maybe soften up the brush a little bit and come back on this one. It's not too bad. The hardest ones you'll find is when it goes across another area. So what I'm going to do, again, is work really small. Work nice and small and kind of do this area that's the even tone, then come across the little shadow part of the crease of the cheek, and then something like that. It's not perfect. I would probably go back and darken up this area to make it match, but that's beyond what we're doing in this class, guys. So again, the best technique is just to work a little bit smaller, not too big. Zoom in like this so you can get really into the details. Okay. So I like to do it nice and methodical like this. As I clean up an area, just kind of scan around, scan around, scan around, and then down, and then back and forth in sort of lines like this. Usually I take about 4 passes to do that. You know, kind of left and right horizontal passes. It usually takes me, you know, down and back 4 times to get the whole picture. But you can even work a little closer than I am right now. Okay, so that's step 1. Clean off the dust and scratches and little imperfections in the scan. Okay. Once you have done that, then you can begin to make some actual adjustments to the photo. So we do have dodging and burning tools here in Photoshop, and you for this class you can use them, but they're really not ideal. They're really not great because they do end up actually permanently destroying pixels. So we want to be non-destructive with our editing, so we generally want to use adjustment layers with masks like this. So let me show you really quickly how that works. So um, these are your adjustment layers here. This is the icon. If you don't see anything over here on the panel, if you don't see what you're looking for here on the right hand side, you can always go up to Window and find the panel you're looking for. So this is adjustments. It's already checked there. So here it is, open right here. So the few that I think you're going to be interested in working with, you can work with brightness and contrast, but I find that this is actually pretty rough, pretty kind of brutal adjustment. It just kind of takes all the pixels and makes them brighter, or all the pixels and makes them darker. And I don't think that that is very useful for at least the way I work. So to have a little more control, I would recommend using either the levels or the curves tools. Exposure can also be a little bit better. It's a little bit smarter, but it is kind of just a big sort of blanket adjustment to just adjust everything evenly, basically, and equally. So I would recommend working with levels and curves. So we'll see the difference between these. Here's levels. This is a histogram. Okay. And I think we'll actually talk about histograms maybe a little bit next week. But this is a measure, this is a graphical representation actually of the data in my picture, of the light data in my picture. So this side of the histogram is the dark area, the shadow area, so maybe this the chair here. This is the midtones, so kind of, you know, all the normal tones like this. The right side represents the highlights and the whites of the photo. So maybe this is the very edge of the right edge of the histogram here where it's very bright. These areas might be, you know, stripes on a shirt, things like that. Okay. So what we do here is just slide these sliders to one way or the other, and it starts to you know, change the shape of the histogram, and so that changes the overall look of our photo. So the mid-tone slider I think is the best one to start with. So if you slide to the right, you basically add more contrast. It's not making everything darker, but it's taking kind of the mid-tones and shoving them kind of to the left, actually. I know you're sliding to the right, but it's taking these tones that were in the middle. So this represented the middle before. And then now we've made the middle of the picture here. And so all of these tones in this area of the histogram kind of shifted down. So you saw that effect in the picture. So if you want to increase the contrast a little bit more, you can bring in the black slider just a little bit. Here, this will kind of attempt to maybe brighten up the photo if you bring in the white slider. If you have something crammed up against the right side, this may not fix that. Okay. Let me see actually if this does anything for us in this photo. It kind of does. I don't think I would mess with this. I would just adjust overall brightness and contrast with the mid-tone slider there. So that could do the trick. You could also use the curves tool. Here's our histogram again. And what this does is you can actually pull up on portions of this line and create a curve. Right? And what you're doing is taking areas of the histogram and basically pulling them up. So the brights get brighter if you pull up on this area, but the darks also get a little darker. So if you want to preserve those, you can drag down here. Okay. And a fairly common technique is to do an S-curve like this, maybe a little more gentle than I just got, but a gentle S-curve like this will add a little more contrast. So you see that the darks got a little darker, the brights got a little brighter. I don't know if that's necessarily appropriate for this photo, but just for sake of demonstration. So you can see the effect that we're having here by turning the visibility of the layer on and off here. So you see here's the original, well, there's the levels adjustment I did, but here's the original, and then here's with the curve layer adjusted. Just gives it a little more contrast. The shadow areas, the dark areas get a little darker, and then the highlight areas got a little brighter. And so you see the result actually is things got a little sharper looking, right? The contrast here in the hair and the eyes, which is kind of the important part of the photo, that gets a little bit sharper. Okay. So if you want to get a little more advanced with it, or if you already have some Photoshop skills, you can use a layer mask. So you notice that each of these has a little white thumbnail next to each of them. If you only want to affect a certain part of the picture, you can fill this layer mask with either black or white. So black, the rule is black conceals and white reveals. So if the mask is painted black, this curves effect won't be doing anything on that black area of the photo. So what I've done on this one actually is everything is black except for this white area that represents the eyes. So you see as I turn this visibility on, this is a curve layer that only affects the eyes. It brings the eyes a little bit back up, gives a little more brightness in the eyes. They get a little dark there. Okay. So there's the original, and there's with this new curves layer. So here's what it looks like. I just kind of made a nice straight line where I brought the black point, I brought it to the right, and that just brought all of the shadows up. Okay. And then in order to only affect the eyes, I have a mask that's painted all in black except for white, which is revealing the effect on the eyes. Let me show you how that works really quickly. So let's say I want to do it again with this curves layer. Maybe I want to affect, let's see, which part? Well, let's work on the mouth area maybe, just for demonstration. So what you can actually do is fill this with black to start with. So I can get my fill bucket tool by hitting G. It's over here on the toolbar. And just make sure that you have the default black and white colors right here. If you don't, you can click on them to select black as a color, or you can just hit D to get back to the default colors. Okay, white and then black. If you want to switch these around, just hit X or this little thing, this little arrow to switch back and forth. Okay, so I got black as my foreground color, got my layer mask selected, and I will just fill it with black, and you see that kind of turns off all of that curve that we just did. But now if I get the brush tool over here on the left, B for shortcut, I can switch over to white. And then as I brush here along the mouth, you see it get more contrasty. It takes on the curve that we applied to it, this curve layer that we applied to it. Okay, so you can see here, if I paint over the eyes, it gets darker. I don't want to do that here because I'm trying to bring them back up. But maybe I want to do that with this area of the hair. Maybe this area of the hair needs more contrast from that contrasty curve. Right? So as I paint over that, you see it gets a little sharper and more contrasty. Right? If you mess up, you can just paint back with black. Maybe you don't need, for example, that to be more contrasty, that bright area of the hair. Okay, so this is essentially dodging and burning. Okay, where you take a levels or curves layer, or even a brightness contrast or an exposure layer, and then you add a mask to it. Okay? Again, I am not going to have a problem for this assignment since this is not Photoshop class if you do use the actual dodge and burn tool, which is over here on the tool panel, toolbar on the left. Okay. If you do use these, that's going to be okay. But I think a more proper way to do it is through layer masks like this. Okay. This from last year, if you're curious, somebody asked me how to apply a vignette, so I showed them how to do that using just a levels adjustment, and then I applied a gradient mask. Okay, so it just sort of feathers out to the edge. Okay. With that, then let's move over to talk about printing these, because as part of this assignment, you guys are not going to print in the darkroom for this assignment. You're going to print on inkjet printers, and there's a specific way that we get the best print out of Photoshop. Okay, so we're going to call this good right here, ready to print. If you have cleaned up the dust spots and you've worked on dodging and burning, or just the overall brightness and contrast. Okay, just overall adjustments, get it to where you're fairly happy with the overall levels of things. Not too dark, not too light. Then it's ready to print. So let's talk about that next. Okay, everybody, so now that we have our black and white image ready to print, I'll show you the steps to print. With black and white, it's fairly simple. I'm going to move over to a color one in just a second, but um, you guys will each need to make both a black and white and color print for this assignment. You'll get, there's pieces of paper, there's sheets of paper in the cabinets above. We're trying to limit it to 4 per person. In other words, that's basically two goes at it, you know, two tries at it. So if your first print doesn't come out the way you like it, you have one more sheet of paper. So, you know, total of 4 pieces of paper available for you. You're going to print 2 images, so you kind of have 2 attempts at each image. So to print the black and white image here, once you've got all your adjustments just the way you want them, all the dust is gone, we'll go up to File and Print. Of course, Command P can be our shortcut. If you'll need to set this to be, you know, to follow the Epson 3880. It should be that way by default. I'm not plugged into the printer in the lab, of course, so it does not show with that printer. But first thing you can see is that my picture is sort of horizontal on the sheet, on a sort of portrait-oriented sheet, so I want to change the layout so that the picture is running the correct orientation. So you see on a 35 millimeter sheet, I'm not asking you to crop them. It does say in the directions to crop it for 8.5 by 11, but I'm not necessarily requiring that. That's something that Mr. Roof had done before, but yeah, a 35 millimeter will have a little bit more on the top and bottom than on the left and right, and so something like this is perfectly fine. So what you want to do is, again, all of these steps are on the sheets of paper on the cabinets above the computers. So make sure you follow them carefully, but let me talk about why we use them. So what we do here is actually change this to Photoshop Management's colors. And we do that because we actually want to choose what's called a printer profile. And under here, again, I'm not going to have it because maybe I do. Let me look here. Oh, I actually do. Yeah. Well, that's for luster, and you guys have glossy paper there. It's pretty much the same, but you will find what's called a printer profile for the Epson Stylus 3880. You'll see, again, it should be premium luster. Mine's photo luster, but very, very similar printer profile. And you see it says .icc. They're also called ICC profiles. That's the file type. So when we click on this, what this does is it actually tells the printer specific information, specific color information about our image. In other words, it's saying, all right, Photoshop, I'm printing on this type of printer, so an Epson 3880, and I'm using this kind of paper. And so that ICC profile tells Photoshop what to do with the colors, what to do with your image in order to get, in order basically to match what's on the screen as closely as possible to what comes out of the printer. You're never going to have an exact match, and that's just the nature of things. The screen has, you know, much wider gamut. You can see so much more contrast and colors on the screen than you can print on a piece of paper. So it's never going to be exact, but we should try to get it as close as we possibly can. And so we have to make sure that we change this to Photoshop Manages Color, and most importantly, that we choose printer profile that matches the printer we're using and the paper type we are using. Okay, and then under rendering intent, we're just going to leave this relative colorimetric. Basically each of these shifts colors. As I said, the screen, the digital file has a bunch of stuff that can't print. So the computer has to decide what to do when stuff is out of gamut. In other words, when it can't print on the printer and paper. So each of these things tells the computer to do something different with those things. Like if a black is too dark, what should it do? If a white is too light, what should it do? If it doesn't have a certain color of like purple, what should it do? So each of these does different things, but I by no means expect you guys to know about those. So let's just stick with relative colorimetric for now, and you can use black point compensation. That's fine. Okay. You don't need to, you shouldn't, I don't think, on your scan have to mess with this. Just by default, it should kind of scale it, but you may need to check scale to fit media if it's too small or just too big, something like that. But it should be fine by default. But if it's not quite the right size, you saw mine scaled mine up a little bit, it's okay. It wasn't too small to begin with, but you can go ahead and check it and see how it does. And so I think that that should be it. Then you load the paper in the tray above, on the top of the printer, and it's ready to go. Okay. So we hit print, of course, and then you can examine what comes out of the printer, and if it's too light or too dark, then you can go back to Photoshop and make some adjustments and reprint. Okay. All right, so that's black and white color, or black and white printing, but there's one additional consideration if you're printing something in color, which you guys will be doing for this assignment. So I'll come over to a color image rather, and this one's not a scan, and it won't be a scan. You can take a color image using really any device you'd like to. I would just ask that it's something fairly high quality. Honestly, an iPhone is okay if that's what you have access to, but a digital SLR would be great. But it can be any digital file, but this one will not be a scan, so you won't have to clean up all the dust spots. You will use levels and curves adjustments maybe. Okay. But the new thing that I do want to talk about is something called color balance. You see this photo actually, and in the end, I kind of wanted it to be a little bit blue because just our specific school colors and things, and the colors in the gym, and so I kind of matched it up for a purpose and did this sort of cross processing where warmer tones mixed with darker shadows, but. Say this is overall too blue. It's too blue. We want to adjust that. Maybe our photo's too cool, or it's too warm. So too blue or too orange and yellow. What we can do is actually use another one of these adjustment layers here. You see the little scales. That's called color balance. So what you can do is sort of add and subtract different wavelengths of light. So this is the most common one to use, the blue and yellow one. So if it's too blue, if it's too cool, I can just slide this towards the yellow end, and that warms it up. Okay, maybe making it look a little more natural. Maybe if you have too much, if you have color cast, somebody standing on a tree, it might be too green, so you can slide it to the magenta side of things possibly. Okay. All right, this is the most common one to use, the yellow and the blue. And so you can just slide it until it kind of looks good by eye for now. There are much more precise ways to do color balancing and much better tools for this, but again, that's for another time. I just want to introduce you to the concept of color balance. So once then you've got your tones looking natural, your colors looking natural, nothing looks, if a person's face is orange, for example, that's probably not natural. We need to dial that back. You might cool that off then, right? But after you've got that looking fairly natural, then it's basically time to print. But there's one other thing. You can also do this with black and white, but there's one other thing that I think is really helpful when you're working with color. There's a tool up at the top here called soft proofing. It's under the view menu. It's proof colors, Command Y for short. And when you do that, the computer is attempting to preview what your print will look like. It's still not exact, but it's maybe a little more exact than just the default Photoshop view. So what I'll do is do proof setup and custom, and then under device to simulate, I'll find that paper profile that we were using to print. So Epson 3880 photo luster, right? Relative colorimetric, black point compensation. These are our printing settings, right? I do also sometimes do simulate paper color. I think that can be helpful. And then I'll hit OK. And you see that drastically changed the image there. So I can turn that on and off with Command Y. That's what Photoshop shows me by default. That's what Photoshop says it will print like. Okay? If that's okay with you, then fine. If not, then we need to go back in and do some adjusting. Maybe there's too much red in it now. We'll dial down. Maybe we need to cool it back off now, okay, etc. Okay? Whatever yours needs, I think that the soft proofing process is really helpful. It basically, I mean, it just saves time and paper. Otherwise, you got to print and print and print and print and come back to Photoshop. This is an attempt to show you what's actually going to come out of the printer. Still not going to be exact, but closer than just the default, which was this. Okay. So now that you've got it proofed, you can go up to File and Print. And again, using same settings as we did before, we'll turn it landscape. And this one is going to need to be scaled. It's a small export, not intended for this purpose exactly, but this one does need scaled. Yours may, if it's an iPhone picture or something like that, may need scaled up. Okay. The same printer profile, relative colorimetric, all the same settings as we used for black and white. Just one extra step in there of adjusting the color balance. You don't have to mess with color balance with black and white, of course, because you don't have those color casts visible. Okay. So essentially the same process. I did skip in this color image doing levels and curves. So those overall levels and brightness and contrast things, you'll still need to do that. If your picture is too dark, you'll bump it up. Okay, but there's one extra step here of adjusting color balance. Okay. So for this assignment, you will turn in both a color image and a black and white image. So let me go over to eClass to finish this off and just go through this in detail. I think we've gone over it all, but again, you'll be turning in 2 inkjet prints. Okay. One will be from a scanned black and white negative. You can use any negative you've shot so far, something you have not turned in before, I should say. Okay, so just an image you haven't turned in for a previous assignment. So you'll need to clean the dust off that image and adjust the overall levels. So brightness and contrast, levels and curves. All right, and then print that. And the second will be a color image. All right, so I say DSLR is fine, but point and shoot camera will be nice. Honestly, phones are so good that if you have high, good light, and you can keep the camera steady, that's probably going to be okay. Not in a dark room maybe, but iPhone will probably be okay. So you will also print this the same way. You will be adjusting overall exposure, but again, you'll need to be concerned with the color temperature, also called white balance. Okay. So again, that'll be a total of 2 prints. You can use a total of 4 sheets if you wish. If the first print doesn't come out well enough, you can go back to Photoshop and make some adjustments and reprint. And I would highly recommend doing that. I would highly recommend printing it once to see what you get, and then going back to Photoshop and making some tweaks and kind of honing it in just a little bit. Okay? All right, so again, guys, this will be due in 2 weeks, April 3rd. We have a gap here, which the portrait project critique will move into when I'm back on the 27th, and these shift down a week. Test lighting and portraiture next week. Quiz over digital basics the week following. I have some things that I'll have to add to it, I think, actually, next week that are best done maybe in person. Okay. So that's the plan for the next week, couple of weeks actually, but let me know, of course, by email if you have any questions about this lecture or the assignment, my expectations for the assignment. Certainly, please ask the lab assistants as you're working in there, but then you'll also see me next week before you have to turn in this final, the final prints for the digital assignment. Okay, I think that's all I have for you. Again, sorry I couldn't be with you this evening. Hope you guys have a great evening and a great week.